Good evening. Let's continue our study in the book of Genesis. If I can get all my ducks in a row up here. We just kind of switched gears last class period and looking at, and really this section of Genesis, and really a lot, if not all, of the book of Genesis is just about who's the main character. Adam and Eve were the main characters, and we shifted to Noah and then to Abraham, and then, of course, to Isaac, Jacob, and now we have shifted to Joseph. He is the one of the 12 sons, of course, of Jacob. By this time, also Jacob, also known as Israel, hence the name of the nation that would proceed from him. Um, but to kind of remind ourselves of where we're at, let's look at our timeline here. I think it's always important from time to time, no pun intended, to kind of look at a timeline to consider where we're at in the Bible story. Uh, Depending upon how familiar you are with the text, you can kind of just get lost that this is an interesting story and maybe there's lessons from it, but where does this story fit within the story of the Bible? And if we do a timeline of just the book of Genesis, this is a timeline of the book of Genesis. There may be some events and characters that you would add in there that I don't have. Of course, we start with the creation. I don't know if I can get my clicker to, there it goes. There it goes. Creation, and then, of course, in chapter 3, sin enters into the world, and then that sin continues in the story of Cain and Abel. And then I just skipped ahead to the next story. We can see how sin has compounded to now God destroys the whole world through the flood. And we have the story of Noah and his children. And then we have the story of the Tower of Babel. And then again, now we pick up with the main character of Abraham. We are introduced to him initially as Abram. Um, and then, of course, the story of Hagar and Ishmael, the failed attempt to help God fulfill his promises. And then the infamous story of Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham's kinsman of Lot. And then finally, the story of the birth of Isaac from the marriage of Abraham and Sarah. And then Isaac finds a wife, Isaac and Rebekah. And then they have two sons, Jacob and Esau. We just recently studied about that. And now Jacob finds a wife, but his father-in-law had a buy one, get one free deal. And so we have Jacob with Leah and Rachel. And then the story progresses into the sons of Jacob, 12 sons and one daughter. And then, of course, Jacob, in that famous wrestling match, is renamed Israel. And now we move into this section where we're looking at tonight, or we looked at really last time, is the jealousy between Joseph and his brothers. Remind me of, let's make a list. It's kind of a short list. Why did they sell him into slavery? Why were they jealous of him? What kind of brought that to a head? All right, Dad picked a favorite and let it be known that he was his favorite. And that usually will breed jealousy among siblings. What else? All right, yeah, he ratted out four of his brothers. Again, justified, unjustified. In some sense, as far as the story progresses, it doesn't matter. If your brothers told on you, it doesn't matter what you did, whether they were justified in doing that, that's going to bring out jealousy and hatred. So there's that. What else? Okay, a dream that seemed, pretty eager to share with his brothers. You're all going to bow down to me. In fact, not just you, but father and mother are going to bow down to me. And then with the jealousy, of course, the famous coat that was given to indicate all of that. And so they sell him. The original plan, remember, was to kill him. But Reuben and Judah worked separately there to make sure that that didn't happen. And he is instead sold into slavery. And again, the text mentions three different groups of people, but we believe that those groups kind of had, by this time in history, kind of almost just an amalgamated into one group. And so that's why we have the differences in the name. Chapter 37 then ends with it's saying, verse 36, Genesis 37, verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. Uh, it seems that they got a bargain. If you're trying to get rid of your brother, you're not going to haggle a whole lot on the price. And so they seemed to get a good price, and so that they could sell him to Egypt, to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. Now remember that name, because this is one of the really rare times in the biblical narrative where it's going to stop, and then we're going to say, meanwhile, back at home, this is going to transpire. And so we interrupt the story of Joseph for one chapter to if the things that happened to Joseph weren't bad enough, then we go back and we visit the brothers. And again, not that I'm advocating as for parents to pick a favorite child and to let that be known. But when you look at the other brothers, you can kind of see how he got to be the favorite. The bar was set pretty low, I would argue, from these other brothers. It was easy for Joseph, not that Joseph wasn't a good guy. I think it's obvious as we look at this story of his life that he was a good guy. But his other brothers made it pretty easy for dad to prefer him. And we have particularly this story of Judah in chapter 38. It says in chapter 38, verse 1, it came to pass at the time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son and called his name Shelah. He was at Chezib when she bore him. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Let's pause there. We've seen this in the story of Rebekah, haven't we? That parents were heavily involved, and that kind of was a trend that kind of continued into recent history, and maybe certainly in certain parts of the world still is, that the parents are either heavily involved or maybe the only one involved in choosing a marriage partner for their children. And so Judah is the one who picks the wife for his firstborn named But verse 7, Judah's firstborn was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. Now, I know I sound like a broken record because I'm saying this is the first time. This is the first time. The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings, and it's not surprising that we got a lot of first because, not a lot has happened. But this is the first record, at least, of God singling out and killing an individual. Obviously, a lot of people died in the flood because of their wickedness, but this is our first record of an individual being struck down by God. And so he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. And Judah said to Onan, that's his second son, go into your brother's wife and marry her and raise up an heir to your brother. Now, I think you'd probably be familiar with this practice in Scripture. It's an odd practice still, even though we may be familiar with it from the story. Odd to our way of thinking, certainly. This is going to become a part of the law, but this predates the law. And so how this practice began, we're not really sure. But this idea, and we've seen that already in Abraham and Sarah and all of these, this idea of having a child, having an heir, particularly a male heir, was so important that if someone died, married, died before they had children, then his lineage, his name basically is going to die out. And for whatever reason, the thought was, well, we can't have that. And so we're going to artificially do this. We've seen some artificial things with Hagar and Ishmael happen here. And so the practice is that here it's going to be brothers. When we get to the story of Ruth, it's just going to be near kinsmen. Some near kinsman will step in uh, to that person's wife and have a child, but that child, legally at least, or in the eyes of society, is not mine, it's my dead brother's. And so it will kind of legally, maybe kind of adopting after the fact, and would become his heir. And so that's what he urges Onan to do. But Onan, verse 9, knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass when he went into his brother's wife that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And so we're going to see the transgression of Judah, but we also now see of his children. And does that reflect upon Judah? Probably so. Not necessarily, because we have a lot of records in Scripture of good parents having children that rebelled, and even bad parents having children that ended up being good. I think about in the divided kingdom, we see that a lot. So it's not always, just de facto that if your children are rotten, that means you were a rotten parent. That's not the way we know from experience. That's not the way it works. Now, it might work that way, but it's not automatically that way. But when we see the actions of Judah, we kind of maybe come to the conclusion maybe it was that way in this case. So his first child, we know he was just as sorry as dirt, don't we? Because God killed him. That's how bad he was, is that God just struck him down and killed him. And now Onan, God not going to strike him down yet, but he's not redeemable, is he? Because what makes you think even less of Onan in this story? Or is there something? It's one thing to say, no, I don't want to do that because it's not going to be my heir, and just say, get away from me, woman, I'm not going to do that. But to go through the process, I'm trying to be as delicate as I can here, to go through the process and then say no. If you're going to be, you know, renege on the agreement or on the plan, you do that before, right? Still probably not the right choice in that culture and thing. But he was willing to do the deed, but not to the extent where his son would have an heir. And so, guess what happens to him? Same thing that happened to Big Brother is now that God is displeased with him and strikes him down as well. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter in law, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah is grown. And so maybe what's our saying? Maybe the third time's a charm. Evidently, he's too young now, but if you'll just hang on, he will grow and get old enough. For he says, for he said, lest he also die as his brothers did. Now, again, Judah does not come across good in this story at all. And we'll talk about that statement. Nick?
It just amazes me in these stories where you have a brother who, sinned in God's sight and God struck him down. The other brother just evidently just seemed to blow that off and not think God would strike him down too. Does the same thing, and on and on. Just that they just, I don't know if they didn't think God was serious or if God wouldn't know or wouldn't see or whatever, but uh, we're kind of the same way today.
Yeah.
But when it's immediate, and you see your own brother struck down in front of you, you would think it would take it more to heart.
Maybe I need to toe the line. God's serious about this. He's paying attention to our family in this. But you're right. Times haven't changed. We've all, we see in our society, in our culture, in ourselves even, the idea of doing things that we just know are not going to have a good result and a good outcome to this. But as I said, Judah is not a good character in this at all, because he just says, lest he die as his brothers did. He almost makes it sound like his brothers, his sons just died. Well, they didn't just die. They got struck down by God because of their wickedness and disobedience. And so it almost, to me, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, almost a flippant statement, like die as his brothers die. Well, again, the brothers didn't just die. There's more to it there. Now, in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died, and Judah was comforted and went to his sheep herders at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And it's told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So what we're seeing here is that Judah is just avoiding the third son. He's saying wait, but he's really just, kind of like when you were a kid and your parents said wait, that usually meant it's not going to happen. Or they said maybe, can we go to Dairy Queen? Maybe later. Well, you quickly learn as a kid that means it ain't going to happen, right? And so that's kind of what he does to Tamar here, maybe later. And later, that's just basically a brush off. It's not going to happen because, and again, in Judah's mind, I don't want you killing my third son. Well, it's not, Tamar hadn't done anything to kill his sons. It's his son's responsibility. Max?
Considerable time. That's kind of a statement or whatever, based on we've already covered at least 25 years here in this chapter of time. And
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. What is your idea of a considerable time? Exactly. So she took off, verse 14, her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself. Now, none of this means anything to us, but we're going to find out that this was the attire of a prostitute. And so she's dressing herself up to appear as a prostitute. And that's something, actually, the idea of the veil. And again, in our minds, that's not attached to a prostitute, but even all the way up at the New Testament times, that seems to be the idea that prostitutes wore these veils. So she wrapped herself, sat in an open place, which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and she was not given to him as wife. So she figures out that this ain't going to happen. He's blaming me in some sense for the death of his sons. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot. So again, that was the point. She dressed in a way so that she would appear as a harlot because she had covered her face. Then he turned to her by the way and said, please let me come into you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? So let me get my opinion box over here, because we've got to be careful. But can we assume, we have to be very careful when we're assuming things that aren't clearly stated in Scripture, that if she's doing this, she knows Judah is going to go this way. And so she says, I'm going to dress up like a harlot and go over here, and that will lure him in. Can we assume from that she knew something about Judah's character that, that would work? I think that's a fairly safe assumption that, because if Judah was this upstanding, clean, moral guy, she should have known, well, that's not going to work. But she knew that, or seemed to know that was going to work. So what will you pay me? Verse 17, I'll send you a young goat from the flock. And she says, will you give me a pledge till you send it? How do I know? And so we can already see the wheels turning in Tamar's mind. This is a plan that she has concocted. And he says, "What pledge shall I give you?" So she said, "Your signet and your cord, and your staff that is in your hand." And so what she's asking for is something that's got your name written on it, that's got your initials carved in it, something that I can later point out and prove this belongs to Judah. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. But he did not find her. Then he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside?" And they said, "There's no harlot here in this place." And so he returned to Judah and said, "I cannot find her." Also, the men of the place said, "There's no harlot in this place." Judah says, "Let her take them for herself, lest we be shamed. For I sent this young goat, and you have not found her." And so, in other words, well, we tried. Yes, Adam.
Another character perhaps, lest we be shamed. Now it's your fault, buddy. You couldn't find her. You make this go away, so now it's your fault.
Yeah, that'll make. What a minute! Wait a minute! You don't group me in with you. Yeah, I'm just the mailman. Yeah, yeah. I've got nothing to be embarrassed about. Max.
Refers to the situation with the temple prostitute. So it was all above board since she was a temple prostitute. But
Yeah, the Hebrew language has two words for prostitute. One was just the transactional prostitute, and one was the temple prostitute. Yes. So it came to pass about 3 months after that Judah was told, saying, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot." Now, let's pause here. We're going to see that phrase a lot in Scripture, even in the New Testament, all the way to the last book of the Bible. The book of Revelation talks about, in a metaphoric, spiritual sense, playing the harlot. And so let's talk a little bit about that phrase. And again, try to be as clear as I can, but yet as delicate as I can. The term harlot, and particularly the phrase playing the harlot, and we kind of use that language today, um, can be used in two senses. It can be used in the literal sense of someone who is whose profession is the harlot, whether it's a temple prostitute or what we might just call a street prostitute, that's their job. But then that phrase and even that term, prostitute, harlot, whatever term your translation uses there, it now gets attached to someone who just has loose morals. And we use that, our society uses that language today, that you can speak of someone of being, I'm not going to use the word, but the coarser word for prostitute, and it might just be referring to someone who just sleeps around. And so I think that's the way the phrase, I don't think somebody's saying your daughter-in-law went and became a harlot. She played the harlot. In other words, she's unmarried and she has been having relations. And so she's playing the harlot. And so I think it's important to see, because we see that again in the book of Revelation, that's the concept there of someone who is committing fornication under different circumstances. So anyway, so Judah says, "Well, bring her out and let her be burned." And so again, just the marks against Judah are increasing. That she did that, she deserves to be burned. Now, I did the same thing, but we're not going to talk about that. So she was brought out. She sent to her father-in-law, saying, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." And if this was a soap opera, we'd hear the bump, 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 uh-oh. So she says, "Determine whose these are." And so, kind of like, okay, if I'm to be punished, the man needs to be punished. We got equal rights here. And so let's find the man. I don't know who it is, obviously, but here's his stuff. And it's got his name and initials. I can't make it out. I don't have my glasses on. But will you tell me whose initials, whose names on this stuff? So Judah acknowledged them and said, she's been more righteous than I. Uh, what a change in terminology. She's played the harlot, bring her out and let's burn her, to she's more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son, and he never knew her again. Now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that, behold, twins were in her womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened as he drew back his hand that his brother came out unexpectedly. Kind of reminds us of some other brothers that we read about. And she said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you. Therefore his name shall be called Perez. And I'll give you 3 guesses what Perez means. Afterward his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was Zerah. So again, you have to always stop and ask yourself, you think about these 12 sons. Well, let's say these 11 sons, because Joseph is the exception. We're going to find out a lot about Joseph's life. We're not told a lot about what Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, all these, what they were doing. But we are told this story. And so I have to wonder, why, of all the things that these 11 boys would have done in their life, why are we being told this? Nick, did I see your hand?
Yeah, it's interesting how he says that he was not righteous. He wasn't being righteous at all. If he was really repentant about it, he'd come out and said, "I've wronged," and all those, those kind of things. Like you can imagine David would. But he just said, "No, she was more righteous. I was righteous, but she was more righteous." Kind of how he says it. So I find it. He hadn't really turned a new leaf.
Yeah, you're right. That's more a statement about her character and behavior than it is about his. He's basically saying, okay, put the matches down. We're not going to burn her, but it doesn't really come out and say, burn me. He's talking about her, but he never says really much about himself. That's a good point, which kind of fits the character of what we're seeing in this. And so, any thoughts about why we're told this sordid story? This if it was me, if you're writing my autobiography, you're writing my biography, leave that story out. Sure, Judah, surely he did some good things and some lesser bad things. So, but why is this story, do we think, Mark? Yeah, we see a lot of these stories back to that timeline. If we're seeing the problem of sin, and so this is maybe a big picture story of why we need the Christ. Starting with Adam and Eve, and maybe much of this is, I've often, and I think maybe even to you, have speculated and wondered, why didn't Jesus die on the cross in Genesis 4? Right after the sin problem, why didn't God go ahead and just send Jesus to earth and die on the cross in Genesis chapter 4 and nip it in the bud and be done with it? Why all of this? And again, it's speculation. We get over here in the opinion box, but maybe it's to show that it wasn't just Adam and Eve. And I think maybe that's Paul's point in Romans chapter 5, that we've all sinned. That it wasn't just, if that would have happened, Jesus dies in Genesis, we would look back and say, well, that Adam and Eve, weren't they terrible? But we can't really say that now, can we? Because it was Adam and Eve, it was Cain, it was everybody, it was Abraham, it was certainly Judah, everybody. So we just see that it wasn't just one couple that couldn't keep the commandments of God, that every generation is doing that. We need a solution. We need something. Man can't fix this. God's got to do it. Larry?
Probably camping out in Sinai or something. He writes down in their origin story. I think everyone else in the camp would have been like, wow, in my family, I can't tell you what my great grandparents were doing. That so. You can imagine the Judahites strutting around the camp, and like, oh, okay, everyone, he's finished chapter 38.
Oh, it's about Judah? Read it out so everybody can hear. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was maybe humbling, and maybe that was part of it. It was try to humble these Israelites who often thought they were better than everybody else. And no, you're not really. You need God more, as much, if not more, than the Gentiles. So yeah, that's good. Adam?
As far as maybe a first also, that we have the Canaanite and the family tree of Christ already here. That Matthew mentions Tamar in his genealogy, that we have someone that you wouldn't expect, a situation you wouldn't expect. But obviously, we're reading Genesis. Joseph is the one that this is obviously the best kid, right? So it's going to be his offspring that goes on to be the house of kings and things like that. And no, it's this messed up family tree that here that ends up in the genealogy of Christ. And so, there's something for the Jews that were so concerned about their perfect lineage that, we've already got Canaanite blood here, then this lineage too.
Yeah. Yeah, one of these Tamar, Judah and Tamar, in one of these twins you're right, are included in that genealogy. And so, in some sense, a little bit of a precursor to another woman that makes that list, Rahab, the harlot. That was her last name. She didn't have a choice. But in that list. But I think, well, go ahead, Nick, and then I'll make my point about that.
Here, there's so many stories that are just a story of somebody in power or somebody more powerful than somebody else, just taking advantage of them or doing them wrong. And the only thing to stop them from doing that is obeying God or morals or whatever, And he just chose to just for decades,
Yeah.
to not do what was right to her, and she had no recourse.
Yeah.
And then she was going to get burned, and he was going to nothing happened to him.
Mm.
And I think it's the same, not exactly the same, but when they brought the woman that had been caught adultery to Jesus, and we're going to stone her, there was no mention of who she was with, and they were going to stone her and try to test him and catch him in a tough spot. But it was kind of the same thing. They were going to abuse the woman who was, I could speculate whether it was a setup or whatever for her to then come bring her to Jesus, but she was in a hard position one way or another, I think, just like she was, and they were going to use her to their own end, these people in power. And there's so many stories like that I think God gives us, because he just shows how terrible it is to do people that way.
There's a common thread running throughout Scripture, two threads that are woven together. One is that God cares for the poor and the oppressed. If you think about the New Testament, how much is talked about widows and orphans. In that culture especially, the most vulnerable of humanity, widows and orphans, widows and orphans. God cares about those. The other thread is that God is angered when we mistreat those who are in one way or another beneath us, are dependent upon us. And so, and God, when you see, we normally think about the captivity, well, it was idolatry. Well, that was always on number one on the list. But number two on the list was the way you've treated the poor and the oppressed and the foreigner and those kind of things. So that thread runs throughout, is that God cares about those weaker, vulnerable, and he is angered when we mistreat those. And so there's a story there. That may be, to Adam's point, one of the reasons is that this, as ugly as this story is, it does move the story along of the genealogy of Christ in these flawed individuals. And I'm not, let me make this point clear, I'm not saying that this is the reason that this story is told, but I think it's a lesson that we can apply to this story. If we were to modernize this story I think our culture would easily advocate that a person in Tamar's situation would be a good candidate for abortion. That here's a woman in a weak, vulnerable state. She has this child out of wedlock. That's an understatement, isn't it? That she's been abused by this man in multiple ways. She's now pregnant in this situation. I mean, she would be the poster child for the abortion clinic, wouldn't she? But we see in this story, and again, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the reason or a reason that the story is included, but that we see in this what we are constantly saying, that that child is innocent. These children were innocent. Now, I would argue that she shouldn't have done what she did. Maybe she was in some sense forced into it, but maybe not the best plan to show this. Certainly, Judah is wrong, and Onan is wrong in all of this, and so many wrong people in this, so much sin involved that led to this conception and this birth. But two people that didn't do anything wrong were the two babies that were born in this. And so we see them not only living, but as Adam pointed out for us, Matthew chapter 1, they're now in the lineage of Christ to show the value of that life. And that's our argument against abortion, is that this is the value of life. That's an innocent life that is being taken, regardless of the circumstances of conception, as ugly as they are, and maybe it should have been avoided. That doesn't change the fact that the results of that are that here's some innocent children. And again, this is maybe not a strong argument against abortion, but children that can go on, if they're allowed to live, and do wonderful things. And one of these children goes on to do we don't know what else they did in life, but they did a wonderful thing in having a family and giving birth to a child that gave birth to a child that gave birth to a child that gave birth to the Messiah. And so I see that in this story, certainly. So, all right, we didn't get as far as I planned this evening. We will pick up with the story back to the story of Joseph. But I wanted us to back up and look and remind ourselves of the family tree of where we at. We started with Terah, and then Abraham over here on the right side of the chart, and then of course Isaac, and then Jacob, and then of course we have Rebecca and Rachel over here as well. And now Jacob has these children, and in the chosen line, Judah is the son. We're focusing in on the story of Joseph, and it always seems a little strange to me that you would think Joseph is going to be the one in the genealogy that's going to be in the bloodline of Christ, but he is not. His story is focused here, but the bloodline will continue through Judah. And then we'll just remind you again, as we're progressing through history here, that here's the way Scripture looks at this history. That remember this chart we've got up here. This would be, if we're just looking at the male ancestors, this would be Adam, and he has all of these children. Then we kind of reset here with Noah, and so as these generations multiply, we've got all of these different families, but we're not looking at the stories over here or the stories over here. We're just interested. This is just the history of one family. And it's the family from Adam through Noah to Abraham and his descendants. If we ever talk about any of these, like here's the Ishmaelites, but we're going to talk about them, but only as they come in contact with this family. And over here, the Midianites, but we're only going to talk about them. They're only going to enter in the story when and if they interact with this family. And so this is a very narrow. And so there's a lot going on in the world. Advancement, technological advancements, history, wars, all these kind of things that are going on. but they may not make the story because this is just one narrow story of one bloodline, of one family. And that's what we're focused on in looking at the book of Genesis. So, all right, we'll pick up there next time.